received her PhD from Yale. She is the recipient of fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Charles Warren Center for the Study of American History, Harvard University, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, Harvard University, and author of Relative Intimacy, Fathers of Adolescent Daughters, and Postwar American Culture, and A Girl Stands at the Door. Please welcome Professor Devlin.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That was lovely music. Thank you. So I just want to try to give you as much of the book as I can. And then I've been told we'll have coffee afterwards and you can ask me questions. Better?
Yeah.
A Girl Stands at the Door retells the story of Brown versus Board of Education as a story about the young women and girls who were the desegregation plaintiffs leading up to Brown. There were about a dozen lawsuits filed in everywhere from the rural South up to Washington, D.C. prior to Brown in the late 1940s, and about the girls and young women who, in vastly disproportionate numbers, volunteered to desegregate the schools all over, including in Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey, but especially in the Deep South. It's about the girls who sacrificed so much to follow these lawsuits, who risked so much, who suffered backlash from the white communities in which they lived, who suffered backlash also from the black communities often in which they lived. Historians for a long time, when studying Brown versus Board of Education, have looked at Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP. What I do in this book is look at the people on the grassroots level who forced the NAACP to take Brown v. Board to the Supreme Court at least a decade before they planned. Thurgood Marshall was clear about this fact, that was the story, but historians wouldn't listen to him. They wanted to know about himself. They wanted to know about the NAACP presidents. They wanted to know about the lawyers. The book demonstrates that the case wouldn't have happened without these girls' leadership. And in the late 1940s, when they filed these lawsuits, it was really quite radical. And it's hard to imagine now. It might seem like an automatic choice to make, but it truly was not in the late 1940s. It was radical for a few reasons. The first reason is that there were no states in the United States where black and white students went to school together. None. Whether or not school segregation was mandated, whether or not even if it was illegal to segregate students, there was no place in this country where students of color went to school together with white students. The other reason, and this is perhaps more important, is that there was no consensus in the black community about whether equalizing the schools might be a better plan than desegregating the schools. And then finally it was radical because most people believed that if black and white students went to school together, that they would never get along with each other. Many held this opinion. So watching a black girl, which happened over and over again in the late 1940s, approach a white school and attempt to enroll was an incredible act. And when this happened, huge crowds would amass on both sides of the line. So Marguerite Carr attempted to desegregate Elliott Junior High in 1947. She set out to get to the school, and someone tipped off the principal that she was on her way. This happens over and over again in the South. The principal would not even let the girls enter into the school. They never made it over the threshold. So the principal came out and he said to Marguerite Carr, "You don't want to come to this school." And she looked him in the eye and she said, firmly but politely, "I do want to go to this school." She was 13 years old, and it was a fantastic performance. And she recalled to me when I finally found her and interviewed her, she said, it was at this incredible event, all the white students were pressed up against the windows to see what would happen. And all of my the entirety of Brown Junior High, her black school, was lined up on the other side of the street. Students, teachers, the principal, the janitors, the PTA, everyone, what she calls a million witnesses, had come to view this. And to their minds, it was something fantastic. It was something made up. But here this child is just coming on. So that gives you a sense of what these girls were taking on when they agreed to be plaintiffs and when they filed these lawsuits. And they didn't do it lightly, and it took a lot of conversations with their parents. Some girls did it on their own, just kind of wildcat action. They would approach schools and simply attempt to enroll. But what I found over and over again was that it was girls and young women who did this work. So the question at the heart of the book is why? Why did so many girls do this for the cause of school desegregation? And I found a couple of things to be true. The first, and I think the most important, is that girls felt uniquely committed to school desegregation. Young black men were interested in other things, interstate travel, voting rights. When I talk to women, they say things like, I just felt in my heart, in my soul, that it was something I had to do. Or if I didn't do it, who was going to do it? Or somebody had to do it. It might as well be me. And you can get a sense of how popular that job was from that statement. Girls as young as 6 displayed leadership qualities. Jean Fairfax, an NAACP organizer, recalled late in life she had gone down to Mississippi to help the night before the schools were going to be desegregated. And she was talking to all the families. And then the KKK went out and harassed everyone. And they all backed out, except for one family. And so Fairfax remembers, and this is one of her favorite stories that she tells about her years of organizing. She went to their house, and they were sitting around the kitchen table, and then there was a silence. And they were all just thinking, and they were lost in their silence. And suddenly, the girl, Deborah, who was 6 years old, said, well, what's everyone waiting for? I'm ready to go. The second reason why girls predominated is because they were really good at it. What allowed them essentially to look at the edifice of a white school and say to themselves, I can go talk to that hostile, angry principal. I can go over there and talk to those angry white students. I can go over there and hold my own with those students. I can testify in court. I can speak to the white press. Those are the things that girls said to themselves, that parents saw in their daughters, that lawyers saw in girls that they could do. So in order to do these things, you have to have two qualities. You have to have physical courage, which is necessary for any civil rights work, but you also have to have social dexterity. And that is what girls really brought to school desegregation. And you have to be poised, polite, diplomatic, and patient, while also being steadfast and unyielding and steely and committed. Black girls were schooled in these behaviors: politeness, poise, self-possession, from a very young age. And they were schooled in these traits by their teachers, their parents, lawyers, I'll get to lawyers later, teachers, their parents, and ministers. And older girls schooled young girls too. Harassment was a daily part of their lives, traversing the streets of southern cities. Harassment specifically from adult white men. Harassment was a daily, omnipresent part of their lives in the homes where they worked. Mothers took them with them to work from the moment that they could walk. And they were taught to defend themselves by any means possible, but the best was to be self-possessed, to look people in the eye, and to remain calm, and to remain composed, and to speak back. So girls arrived at the schoolhouse door with these traits already intact. Lucille Bluford was the first person to really kick off school desegregation. She applied to the University of Missouri in 1939. She eventually would apply to the University of Missouri School of Journalism 11 times. The school finally branded her a nuisance and barred her from the campus. Her case, Bluford v. Canada, and poor Canada, he was just the registrar. And every time she came, he would have to come out and read her a long, litigious document that the Board of Curators had given to him. Eventually, Canada and Bluford actually became friends through this process, and she remained very fond of him. And when the University of Missouri finally gave her an honorary degree in the 1980s, the first thing she did was go and look up Canada. He was retired at that point and living off campus, and she said to him, she knocked on his door and she said, "Do you remember me?" "Oh, I remember. Come in." And she said, "We had such a nice chat." And that was who Lucille Bluford was. She was always extending herself to others. Eventually, the University of Missouri shut down their School of Journalism in 1942 rather than admit her. This was one of the top journalism schools in the country. After World War II, Ada Sipule became the face of school desegregation. Ada Sipule applied to the University of Oklahoma Law School in January 1946. She became the first and ultimately the only graduate school desegregation plaintiff to outright turn down the state's offer to set up a separate graduate school. When the state offered this separate graduate school, just a lone building in Oklahoma City, she said no, absolutely not, and she stuck to it. And she also proved to be an incredible speaker in a number of different ways. But she was best when she was speaking to the press. Thurgood Marshall wasn't interested in her case. He wanted to pursue graduate education in Texas with a male plaintiff named Helen Sweat. And so Sweat v. Texas, or Sweat v. Painter, is a case that people generally know. So Marshall ignored her for some time. But there was a Supreme Court hearing on her case. She went uninvited and with her own funds. And when she got back to Oklahoma City, when she got off the plane, the press came up to her, the black press, the white press. There was a clutch of reporters. And she met that moment with rhetorical brilliance. She said, "Justice is for everyone in America. It's a wonderful Constitution. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to learn." And the press just ate this up. That made for headlines everywhere. "It's a wonderful Constitution," Ada says on return to the state. And this was the white press. And who at first couldn't stand Ada Sipule and saw her as a threat and just called her the Negro applicant. So she had won over the press by the time 1949 had rolled around. By the end of the summer, she had enrolled in the school, the only black student, the only woman. And by the time she graduated and took her bar exam, the eyes of the world were upon her. And she became the only lawyer in Oklahoma educated within the bounds of the state. She later joined the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma that had tried so assiduously to keep her out of the school. And her last act before retiring was to create an endowed chair for Anita Hill. And Anita Hill told me that Ada Sipule was her source of inspiration. And whenever she felt she could not carry on, whenever she felt like she couldn't hold it together anymore, she thought about Ada Sipule. After Sipule became nationally and internationally famous, girls and their parents began to approach schools. And they did so from rural Texas through Louisiana, and Charleston, South Carolina, and there were many cases too in Virginia and Washington, D.C. In rural Texas, the Jennings twins filed a lawsuit in 1947. And this was actually the first case that Thurgood Marshall argued. The NAACP contacted him and said, "We filed this case." They did the same thing. They walked up to the school, they talked to the principal, which principal turned them away, and then they just filed a lawsuit with the local lawyers. The Jennings twins, Doris Fay and Doris Ray, had to be sent away ultimately because the KKK was threatening to kill them, threatening to kill their father. He would sit up nights with a shotgun waiting for them to come, and eventually it became clear that they had to go away from school. The NAACP collected enough money to send them to a seminary in Crockett, Texas, which is about sort of midway between Dallas and Houston. They stayed there for 2 years. But then what happened is that the state of Texas built a new high school for the high school students in her Texas, where they're from. And when the new high school was built, the members of the local NAACP no longer supported the desegregation lawsuit. So the funds dried up, but it was still not safe to come home, so they stayed in Houston with an aunt. Eventually, they did go back to Hearn. They did go to the black high school that the state had built. But they were in a difficult position because at that point, desegregation had become unpopular, but they and their family were still committed to it. So that gives you one sense of what it was like for these girls. Doris ran Doris Fay. Don't remember much about Marshall, except he was very tall. And nothing happened with their lawsuit because they graduated before Brown v. Bois could be taken to the Supreme Court, and no one had talked to them when I interviewed them. No one had told their story, and no one knew about their lawsuit. So they were actually quite surprised when I contacted them. So many cases started coming through from all over the South that Marshall realized ultimately that they had to take the cases to the Supreme Court. If they didn't take a case to the Supreme Court, another lawyer would. And if another lawyer took the case to the Supreme Court, there was no good outcome. If he, and I'm not saying he, because almost all lawyers at this time were men, if he won the case, the NAACP would lose its status as the premier civil rights organization and as a premier litigation organ for the race. If that lawyer lost the case, civil rights would be further entrenched and set back the cause for desegregation, who knows for how long. Marshall was actually a conservative lawyer. He wanted to win cases. He was very hesitant to take on this case. But the cases kept coming, and the telegrams kept coming, and the anxious phone calls kept coming, and local lawyers kept contacting us, and how should we manage this? And the parents and the young women were so determined and so patient and taking on so many risks that finally they forced Marshall's hand. There was also local lawyers who leaned on Marshall. They said, come on, we have to do this now. So they start fighting the case in 1950. So as we know, Brown v. Bois is decided in 1954. Probably, it's, legal historians think it's the most important civil rights case of this country. After Brown, it would take about 10 years for schools to finally start desegregating in the South. And here again, we're going to see the same phenomenon. So the Little Rock Nine, 6 girls and 3 boys. New Orleans in 1960, 4 girls desegregated the first grade. People know Ruby Bridges, but there were 3 other girls who also desegregated that year. In Charleston, 7 boys and 3 girls. In Baton Rouge, 18 girls and 5 boys. I could go on, I'll stop with that, but it's quite remarkable. And I interviewed as many women as I could find. It's hard to find women. They get married and change their names. That's why this book took 10 years to write. But I also interviewed the men too. What is quite striking about what these girls pulled off is that, again, their ability to speak to white adults is what got them into those schools. Again, their commitment led them to the superintendent's office, but their ability to speak with poise and grace and patience is what got them in. So if you applied to transfer to a white school, you had to have great grades, you had to have come from an intact family, you had to pass a psychological exam. But the really important component of this was the meeting with the superintendent. And and the superintendent was really meant to be an intimidating meeting and to make sure that these girls were turned away, that they didn't want to come, that it frightened them. So in these meetings, girls were often quite brilliant. And I talked to Ruby Bridges. So she was only 5 when she had this meeting, and she said to me, I don't really remember what I said in that meeting. I remember the meeting very well. It was scary. But I remember coming out and thinking I had done so well, I was going to college. Another similar example is Millicent Brown. The summer of 1963, her father just said, put on your nicest clothes, your Sunday dress, we're going to the school board. Her mother had been trying to transfer her to the white school nearest her home since 1955. She said, okay, they get in the car, And when they get there, the secretary opens the door of the office, and she said, "They're ready for you." And Millicent walks in, and to her surprise, there's the entire Charleston school board sitting around a table, all male, all white. And they said, "Have a seat." And they started showering her with questions. Do you like your black school? Do you like your teacher? Do you like your extracurriculars? Do you like your friends? Yes, yes, yes to all the questions. And finally, they lob at her what they think is going to be the coup de grace. They say, "Well, why would you want to leave all that and come where you don't know anybody?" And Millicent, as unprepared as she was, shot back, "Well, I make friends wherever I go." Effectively, she had turned the question back on them. So, I don't know what you do when you go to a new place, but I am a civilized person and I make friends. And she had checkmated the whole room. And it was her humanity and her simplicity and her grace in that moment that made it impossible for them. And she knew it too. She said, when I got out of that room and I looked at my father and the lawyer he brought with me, they knew from looking at me that I had done what I had done. She had talked her way into the school. True to her word, she was pictured on the cover of the New York Times in September 1963 in front of Rutgers High School, formerly all white, speaking and ostensibly making friends with a white girl that she was speaking to. The New York Times said, "School integration begins peacefully." But what really bothers Millicent about that picture is that they were outside because there was a bomb threat. In 1963, the 18 girls who desegregated Baton Rouge High, all of those girls, they were going into their senior year. And most of them were either at the Southern Lab School, which was a historically black college's teaching school. Most of them were either, they knew that they were going to be a salutatorian or valedictorian of their class. They were the best of the best. And that year, the Adolescent was recruiting students to transfer. And these young women put themselves forward. And in every case in Baton Rouge, they did so over the objections of their mothers and some of their fathers, but mostly their mothers. They didn't want them to go there. They were terrified for their daughters. They had seen what had happened in New Orleans with all the crowds and the yelling and the violence. But these girls were determined to go. They were 17 years old, 16, 17 years old, and they had it was their choice, and they made it. Inside Baton Rouge High, it was incredibly violent, as it was in New Orleans. People hit them as they went down the hall. They tripped them. Sometimes they spat in their food. They threw food at them. They made it impossible to drink from the water fountain. They put ink in their lockers. And they also left death threats in their lockers. And they signed the death threats from the KKK. It was very frightening. And it was very demoralizing. The worst part of it, though, what all of them told me to a person, even the people who suffered the worst violence. And in New Orleans, one of the girls had been actually hit with a bat. And in Baton Rouge, one of the girls had her hair set on fire. And what all of them tell me, though, is that the worst part of it was that the teachers encouraged it. Almost all of the teachers encouraged it, and they felt so betrayed by this. But because they never spoke in class, because no one spoke to them in the school, it was the loneliness that was so much worse than the violence. And I have not spoken to a desegregation person who has not agreed with this, that the loneliness was the worst part. And going to school every day, day after day, for 9 months of the year, 7 hours a day, sitting in a room as the sole black person, was so emotionally exhausting. But that by the time that they got to the end of it, all of them felt, they said, depressed and worn out. And some of them thought at that time that it wasn't worth what they had done. But later in their lives is when they began to realize how important, they knew how important it was when they were doing it, but later in their lives, they actually took from that experience and used it, and many of them came to be desegregated desegregation first in their chosen professions. So it was those who desegregated the schools, not only in the South, sorry, I'm used to being in the South, not only in the South, but in the Northeast too. Those who desegregated went on to desegregate school facilities, school faculties, law offices, government offices, architecture offices. If you look at any of these spaces, and if you talk to the black women in them of a certain generation, just above mine, most of them were school desegregation firsts. So they recognized how much impact they had in desegregating. And when they talked to me, they talked about how important what they did was. Not just for the schools, which they recognized that hadn't gone as they had hoped, but for the wider society. And Deborah Gray White, who teaches at Rutgers University, said to me, when Obama says that he stands on the shoulders of the civil rights leaders who came before him, he doesn't stand only on their shoulders, he stands on our shoulders too. We who went into these schools all over and lived our lives day in, day out to create a more desegregated society, they all felt this way. And so while they realize and they accept and they bemoan the state of our schools now, they are steadfast in their belief in the cause for what they did, for which they sacrificed. And I would only say, in terms of my own relationship to this project, I'm so grateful these women picked up their phones and were willing to let me interview them, especially as a white woman. It was initially quite hard. Cold calling people is hard anyway, but I thought maybe they won't talk to me. Only a few people turned me down. And by and large, none of these women had been interviewed. So their stories were fresh and new. And I think it's very important to begin to recognize what they did. Margaret Carr, who tried to desegregate Elliott Junior High, when I called her, she was my first call. And I went to D.C., I had to go to the Marriage Bureau, look up her marriage license, find her new name. And I called and said, Mrs. Stokes? And she said, yes. I said, this is Rachel Devlin, I'm writing this book, I understand you filed a lawsuit, would you be willing to talk to me? And she said, what took you so long? But that was, no one had talked to her, no one had talked to any of these women. So I want to find, hopefully with this book, a way to honor them, a way to include them in our own history and our own identity as a country. Thank you.